Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are finally able to check out the 12 and 24 core 2nd gen Threadripper parts known as the 2920X and the 2970WX. Now I say finally because it was about two and a half months ago now that we first checked out the 16 and 32 core models known as the 2950X and the 2990WX. So we have had to wait quite a while for the 12 and 24 core parts, but AMD did warn us when we reviewed the initial 2nd gen Threadripper parts that the rest of the lineup wouldn't arrive until October. And I suppose we are still in October, even if we are at the tail end of October, but here we are finally able to review them. But before we get too far into the review, today's video has been sponsored by LastPass. With LastPass, you don't have to write or remember any passwords. They can generate a unique password for every website, store it securely in the cloud, and autofill it into websites to make your life much easier and so much more secure. Both Tim and myself have been using LastPass for years now, so it's a service that we trust and can highly recommend. For more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so as is often the case with these day one reviews, we weren't given too much time to put this thing together. So that being the case, rather than massively rush all the testing, I'm going to provide two videos. There'll be a follow-up video tomorrow, which will include more gaming benchmarks. Today's video is focused on productivity benchmarks with a very brief look at gaming. Before we get into the benchmarks, here's a quick refresher covering the design and specs. There's two models in the WX series, and the W signifies that this is a workstation series. The workstation 2990WX and 2970WX models are configured very differently to the 2950X and 2920X processors. Whereas the 12 and 16 core models pack 2 Zeppelin dies, the 24 core and 32 core processors feature 4. Typically, such a configuration would have 4 dual channel memory controllers for 8 channels. This, however, isn't possible on the X399 platform, limiting these super core heavy parts to quad channel memory. Although there are 2 more Zeppelin dies, the additional 2 dies are compute dies, in AMD's words. This means they have no local PCIe or DRAM access. For that, they must travel via the Infinity Fabric to the I/O dies. As there are twice as many dies, the Infinity Fabric bandwidth is also halved, so now the throughput between dies is just 25 gigabits per second, assuming using DDR4 3200 memory. Because of this design that sees 2 of the dies without direct access to the DRAM, it means unlike the 2920X and 2950X, the 2970WX and 2990WX use NUMA exclusively. AMD claim that this quad NUMA configuration allowed them to create the world's first 32-core consumer processor, and just as important, it has allowed them to do it while maintaining backwards compatibility with existing TR4 products. This did cause some compatibility issues, or rather, I should say performance issues, with games and applications. And I guess also the Windows 10 operating system. The Windows 10 scheduler has been proven to be very inefficient at managing these core-heavy CPUs, and we found significantly better performance when testing the same applications with a Linux-based operating system. Unfortunately, this still remains a huge problem for the 2990WX, and therefore we suspect it will also be true for the 2970WX. And while Microsoft hasn't done anything to improve the situation, at least yet, AMD has. The latest installment of the Ryzen Master software, which will be available for download today, introduces a dynamic local mode, and crucially, to enable this mode, you don't need to reset the system. In AMD's words, dynamic local mode is a new piece of software that automatically migrates the system's most demanding application threads onto the Threadripper 2990WX or 2970WX CPU cores with logical memory access. In other words, applications and games that prefer local DRAM access will automatically receive it, but applications that scale to many cores will still be free to do so. It's great to see AMD working hard to improve the user experience with these high-end desktop processors, but ultimately the biggest improvements will come when Microsoft updates the Windows scheduler. For now, the 2990WX and 2970WX will be safer purchases for those using a Linux-based operating system, but for certain tasks such as rendering, they are still beasts in the Windows environment. Specs-wise, the 12-core part is virtually identical to the 16-core part, obviously minus a few cores, and the same is true when comparing the 24-core and 32-core parts. That being the case, I won't go over all the clock speeds, cache capacity, and all that stuff again. That'll just delay us getting to the good stuff, the benchmarks. For testing, all systems were configured with DDR4 3200CL14 memory. The quad-channel platforms received 32GB and the dual-channel system 16GB. The Threadripper CPUs were benchmarked with the NMAX Lick-Tech 360TR4, while the Skylake-X CPUs used a 360mm open-loop setup. This won't skew the stock performance in Intel's favour though. The Coffee Lake and 2nd Gen Ryzen parts were both tested with the Corsair H115i Pro, and finally the graphics card of choice is Gigabyte's RTX 2080 Ti Gaming OC. Alright, time for the benchmarks. As expected, the 2920X roughly matches the 1920X and 2950X when it comes to sustained memory bandwidth performance. The 2970WX though, it's surprised with a throughput of 67GB per second, which is a few gigabytes per second faster than the 2990WX and 6% more memory bandwidth than a typical Threadripper CPU. Cinebench single thread performance is right where we'd expect it to be. The 2920X scored 178 points, placing it on par with the 2950X, while the 2970WX matched the 2990WX and the older 1920X. Of course, it's the multi-threaded performance that's of most importance for these core-heavy CPUs, and here we see the 2970WX cleaning up, coming second only to its 32-core version. A score of roughly 4,300 points made it just over 30% faster than the Intel Core i9-7980XE. Meanwhile, the 2920X just edged ahead of the 1920X, making it just 25% slower than the Intel 16-core 7960X. And in advance, I'm going to apologize for all the X's in this video. Again, the 2920X offers a small performance improvement over the 1920X, this time in our Blender workload. The 2970WX is also a big step up from the 7980XE, as it was again a little over 30% faster. It was also 36% faster than the Threadripper 2950X, taking just 9.5 seconds, and that meant it was just 13% slower than the 32-core 2990WX. Meanwhile, the 2970WX was still faster than the 7980XE in Corona, though unlike the previous test where it won by a 30% margin or greater, here it's just 8% faster. The 2920X was again a few percent faster than the 1920X and 9% faster than the 9900K, and that is of course running the 9900K without a TDP limit in place. The last rendering benchmark that we're going to look at is V-Ray, and again the 2970WX makes short work of the more expensive 18-core processor from Intel. Here it beat the 7980XE by a 22% margin. It was also just 13% slower than the 32-core 2990WX, so a solid result for the new 24-core part. The 2920X also does well, despite offering just 5% more performance than the 1920X, and here it was 13% faster than the Core i9 9900K. The PC Mark 10 gaming benchmark shows the 2970WX doing much better than the 2990WX, though the 2950X is still by far the best Threadripper CPU in this test, and well, the best CPU overall. 7-zip compression performance is an issue for the 32-core processor, at least when testing on Windows, and thus far the issue has not been addressed, and therefore we see the 12-core 2920X just beating the 32-core part, while it smashed the 24-core model. Still, when it comes to file compression performance, Intel does appear to have a reasonably significant advantage. However, when it comes to decompression, the AMD processors certainly do come into their own. The 2990WX is a weapon here, and the 2970WX is also mighty impressive, beating the 7980XE by a 29% margin. The Microsoft Excel benchmark might be a bit redundant now, as most of these high-end desktop CPUs take less than 2 seconds to complete the workload. But we have the results, so why not include them? Intel does enjoy a slight performance advantage in this test, but with the Monte Carlo simulation being such an extreme workload, I doubt anyone is ever going to notice Intel's performance advantage in this application. Where you might notice Intel's performance advantage is when working with H.265 content, as their superior AVX implementation can be seen here. AMD's really core-heavy CPUs also have an issue with the Windows schedule in this test, which certainly doesn't help, and it's the reason why the 12-core Threadripper CPUs are seen matching the 24-core and 32-core models. That said, AMD's 16-core 2950X did put up a decent fight, but even then the 7960X is still 14% faster, though in terms of value the Intel CPU is still much worse. Since reviewing the 2990WX, Adobe Premiere has seen a major update, and with it performance of the 32-core processor has been much improved, though it's still slightly slower than the 16-core model. Still, it was considerably slower previously. The 2970WX basically matched the 2990WX and therefore was slightly slower than the 2950X. Still, while the 2950X offers the most bang for your buck of the higher end Threadripper CPUs in Premiere, the 2970WX still stacks up well against the Intel competition, as it is just 10% slower than the 7980XE. Then we have the new 2920X, which also does very well, though it is only 7% faster than the 1920X, and at launch does cost considerably more. Still, the 2920X was on par with the Core i9-9900K, which ran much hotter without the TDP limit. Here we have our mainstream warp stabilizer test running just a single iteration. I haven't had time to run our dozen simultaneous warp stabilizer tests just yet, but I will include that data in future content. Again, the 2950X is seen to be the best value Threadripper CPU. It's certainly at the high end when testing in Premiere, while the higher 24-core and 32-core parts do seem to lag behind. Okay guys, don't freak out, but for now I've managed to squeeze in just a single game test. Like I said, the focus was primarily on productivity, but tomorrow I will focus on gaming performance for the new Threadripper CPUs, and I will have over 20 graphs for you guys to go over. Here we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider providing a small sample of the work I've done so far. Now here we'll start with the 1080p data, and again I'm using the RTX 2080 Ti. If you want to know the exact quality settings used, please check out Tim's optimization video for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. With the dynamic local mode enabled, the 2990WX and 2970WX are still providing suboptimal frame time performance, though the average frame rate isn't that bad. However, we do see the 2920X and 2950X matching the frame time performance of the 2700X while beating it by a reasonable margin for the average frame rate. I actually went back and retested the 2700X just to make sure there wasn't any kind of update that improved performance, but I did get the same 93 FPS on average in a particular pass in the game. So it seems that the 12 and 16 core Threadripper CPUs are offering a slight performance increase here over the 2700X, which I have to say is most unexpected. However, once we move to 1440p, the 2700X is now able to roughly match the average frame rate of the Threadripper CPUs while offering slightly better frame time performance, though overall performance was much the same between the 2920X, 2950X, and 2700X. They're all comparable to the 9900K, as we are mostly GPU bound in this title. Again, even with dynamic local mode enabled, we are seeing some serious frame time issues with the 2970WX and 2990WX processors. This persisted even at the extreme 4K resolution. As far as I could tell, the dynamic local mode was working, but AMD has reported a few bugs with enabling it. Hopefully they're sorted out for the public release, which should be available now, and perhaps I'll retest with that version. Anyway, as expected, with the exception of the 24-core and 32-core models, we're very much GPU bound at 4K, and here the 2920X was able to get the most out of the RTX 2080 Ti. Moving on to power consumption, and here in Handbrake the results might look a bit odd, given that the 12-core and 24-core parts are seen pushing total system consumption to similar levels. There are, however, a few reasons for this. Firstly, Handbrake doesn't utilize the 24 and 32-core parts very well, so they aren't being pushed as hard as they could be. The other reasons include clock speed and voltage. The 2920X maintained an all-core clock speed of 3.95 GHz at 1.212 volts, while the 2970WX ran at just 3.55 GHz using 1.075 volts. That's a 10% decrease in frequency and 11% decrease in voltage. Blender is a better test to show maximum system draw for these higher core count processors, and here we see the 2990WX pushing total system consumption of 345 watts, while the 2970WX consumed 10% less power. This time the 12-core model is seen reducing system consumption by 15%, which is reasonable given it runs at higher clock speeds with more voltage. In the end, when fully utilized, the 2970WX only pushed total system consumption 8% higher than that of the 7980XE, and remember, it was 30% faster in this workload. Meanwhile, the 2920X pushed total system consumption of 264 watts, which is basically what we saw from the 2950X and 7960X. When it came to temperatures, both CPUs ran extremely cool with the NMAX Lichtech 360 TR4 in place. We were looking at peak temperatures of 40 to 45 degrees after an hour-long Blender stress test, which is just insane. Therefore, I decided to remove the liquid cooler for this test and try out a big air cooler. I went with the Threadripper. The 2920X maxed out at just 61 degrees after an hour, and again this allowed it to run at the same frequency and voltage that was seen previously with the liquid cooler on the MSI X399 creation. Unbelievably, the 2970WX ran just 2 degrees hotter, hitting 63 degrees, again using the Threadripper air cooler on the MSI X399 creation using the default BIOS settings, just XMP was loaded. So when it comes to overclocking, you likely won't be limited by thermals. Speaking of which, I could get both CPUs into Windows at 4.2 GHz, but only the 2970WX was able to pass our stress tests at that frequency. The 2920X would pass quite a few tests, such as Cinebench and quite a few gaming tests, for example, but it would lock up after just 10 minutes of our Blender workloads. And in the time we had available, I wasn't able to stabilize the overclock. That said, at 4.1 GHz with 1.3 volts, it was rock solid and spat out a score of 2,653 points, a 6% boost over the stock out-of-the-box performance. Okay, before wrapping things up, let's go over a few performance versus price scatter plots, starting with Blender. So on this graph, you want to be positioned as low as possible and as far to the right as possible. Lower, of course, means cheaper, and further right means faster. As you can see, the blue dots, which represent the Intel CPUs, well, they're all higher and more to the left than the competition. For example, the Threadripper 2920X destroyed the Core i7-7820X. It also beat out the Core i9-19900K, and in terms of value, the 1920X just destroys them all. Meanwhile, the 2970WX is much cheaper and faster than the 7960X, so an easy win there. Therefore, for those of you taking on 3D rendering tasks, the Threadripper series really is a must. When it comes to video encoding, it's a bit more mixed. Again, the ultimate value award here must go to the 1920X, but the new 2920X, while not as good as the 1920X in terms of value, it does beat out the Intel Core i7-7820X by a rather convincing margin, and even edge out the 9900K. The 2950X also does very well, but unfortunately the 2970WX and 2990WX are underutilized and have issues with encoding workloads, particularly on the Windows 10 operating system. So at least at the very high end of things, Intel does come out on top for this type of workload. That said, the margins when encoding with Premiere are far less brutal for AMD, and while the 2990WX is a still worse value than the 7960X, you could argue that the 2970X actually isn't, offering reasonable performance for a much lower price. That said, the 2950X again makes so much more sense as it's not only faster than the 24 and 32 core parts, but it's also cheaper. The new 2920X roughly matched the 9900K and 7820X. The Intel CPUs were slightly better, but it is a close call. Of course, those price versus performance graphs don't tell us everything about this comparison in terms of value. Now, normally AMD does tend to catch Intel out with lower motherboard prices, along with the inclusion of a decent box cooler. But that's not actually the case with the Threadripper series. So the cheapest X399 boards, they typically cost around $300 US, whereas the cheaper X299 boards, they start at just under $200 US. And this really is a factor for those buying the lower end CPUs on these platforms. Of course, if you're buying a 16-core plus CPU, you're probably looking at spending over $400 US on the motherboard, and that is for either platform. As for the cooler, well, neither the Threadripper or Skylake-X CPUs come with a cooler, so you're looking at a similar expense there. Where AMD currently has a value advantage is in the platform itself. They offer loads of PCIe lanes, ECC memory support, and the ability to expand beyond just 18 cores. The last one's actually quite a big one, especially when 3rd gen Threadripper will work on the same motherboards, so that MSI X399 creation that you spent $500 on won't need to be tossed for a considerable amount of time yet. Okay, so let's first talk about the Threadripper 2920X. This chip has an MSRP of $650 US, which is much cheaper than the $800 US that the 1920X came in at. Basically, AMD's offering 12 cores for the price that Intel will give you 8. And you basically get 3 times the L3 cache and just over twice as many PCIe 3.0 lanes. Then there were just 2 tests where the 7820X actually managed to beat the 2920X. And those 2 tests, well, one of them was Cinebench, the single-threaded test. This stomped it in the multi-threaded. And then the other test was PC Mark 10, though it was very close. For all the other rendering and encoding benchmarks, the new 12-core Threadripper part really did wipe the floor with the 7820X. It was basically a non-contest. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to retest the Core i9 7900X in time for this video. I already had to retest a lot of CPUs, so yeah, couldn't retest them all. But based on the data that we do have on hand, the 2920X will dominate that part as well. It's mostly because the 10-core Intel CPU costs over 40% more. So that's obviously a big markup for not really much of a performance uplift, if any. That just leaves the 9900K, and honestly, if productivity tasks are what you'll be focusing on, then I believe the 2920X is the smarter buy. It will end up costing a little more overall, but for applications that utilize the 12-core Threadripper CPU well, a heavily overclocked 9900K will melt trying to keep up. Of course, if you mostly want a game, then the 9900K is a better choice, though I'd recommend you forget the 9900K exists at all, and let's just be honest right now, pretty much doesn't. Instead, I'd recommend getting an 8700K or perhaps the 2700X. The choice is yours. So whereas I found myself with nothing bad to say about the 2950X when I reviewed it back in August, it's pretty much the same story with the 2920X in late October. The only issue for the 2920X right now is the 1920X selling for a little over $400 US. That's the obvious choice right now, and if I were in the market for a high-end desktop system, that's what I'd be snapping up before the stock runs out. Then we have the 24-core Threadripper 2970WX, which is a 3D rendering beast, just like the 2990WX. Unfortunately though, right now Windows won't allow you to get the most out of this processor in most workloads, so unless you're using or are prepared to use Linux, it's probably not a CPU I'd recommend unless you absolutely know it can blast its way through whatever workload you'll be throwing at it. Overall, I see even less reason to invest in Intel's X299 platform, and if AMD didn't already have the high-end desktop market segment all stitched up last year, they certainly do now. Tim basically summed up the situation well in his video titled Intel Surrenders to Threadripper with new Skylake-X refresh. It's very disappointing that Intel's remained stubborn on pricing and just refused to become more competitive even with the Skylake-X refresh. But I guess no one will be really surprised by that. Anyway, I'm glad we now have the 12-core 2920X on the menu, and I'm hoping that we won't have to wait too long till Windows gets an update to better utilize the 24 and 32-core models. And well, that is going to do it for this one. If you didn't race off to pick up a 1920X, then I hope that means you enjoyed the video. Feel free to subscribe for more content, and if you appreciate the work we do at HardwareBox, then consider supporting us on Patreon to gain access to our little community of enthusiasts on Discord, and you can also catch our monthly live streams. I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.